very good morning, Africa, and thank you for tuning in. It is time for Media Monitor with me, Alicia Jali. Remember, you can share your views on our topics through Twitter, and our Twitter handle is @SA Media Monitor. But first, let's have a look at the leading stories across all media platforms at this hour. Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir has just landed in South Africa, heightening controversy over whether he should be arrested. Now, he's wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, and South Africa is a signatory to the Rome Statute, is formally obliged to arrest him. Goal drought continues to halt Bafana Bafana as they played with Minnows, Gambia, which led them to a goalless draw in their opening AFCON 2017 qualifier. Radio bulletins are leading with the following stories this morning. South Africa is called upon to take action against Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir. Former mine workers are urged to go for medical checkups as government plans to assist them to get compensation. And of course, on our social media there, government is still mum on the arrival of Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, who arrived in the country last night to attend the African Union Heads of State meeting in Sandton, Johannesburg. Bashir is wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Let's see the reactions on social media. Lovom Vinjo says, so SA government as an ICC signatory must arrest Omar al-Bashir. Who does this gratify, and what are Africans doing about it? Martin Plot, BBC News, Omar al-Bashir, ICC urges South Africa to arrest Sudanese leader. And Buhle says, dear ICC, ICC has called on South Africa to arrest Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir. Now, to give us analysis of today's headlines, let's extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Julie Reid, who is an activist for media freedom as well as communications rights. Now, Julie also writes opinion pieces for various newspapers, magazines, online news media, and she's the editor and co-author of the book Looking at Media. And in our Durban studio, we're joined by Mr. Akash Bremdeo, who is currently the editor of the Sunday Tribune. He's also worked in management here at the SABC as a senior assignment editor, Deputy Assignments Editor, as well as a markets anchor for Summit. And we are also joined by our very own contributing editor, Mr. Vuyo Mvoko, joining us in Sandton out at the AU Summit. Vuyo, a very good morning to you. Once again, thank you so much for joining us on Media Monitor. All right, a very good morning to you, Akash in Durban.
Hi.
All right, and Julie here in studio, thank you so much for joining us. All right, let's have a look at the stories that are making headlines today, panel. All right, there it is. It is the Sunday Times, and South Africa is expected to contribute $64 million to the African Union. The City Press is leading with a story about former crime intelligence boss Richard Mdluli still enjoying state perks. The Sunday Independent, former South African Union Secretary General Salim Ahmed Salim warns Burundi about civil war. The Weekend Argus is a story about Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, who faces possible arrest after his arrival in South Africa. Nigeria's Sunday Mail says Sahara journalist apologizes to President Robert Mugabe for her behavior. And the Sunday Express, of course, they're leading with a story about a chief executive of the Lesotho National Development Corporation, Joshua Setipa, who's suspended pending the investigations. The Daily Trust is leading with a story about all contracts that are under investigations. All right, let's look at the newspapers that we are discussing today. Panel, we're starting with the Sunday Times' front page today. And Julie, this is shocking news. The headline reads, SA taxpayers to pay millions more to AU. But basically the story, it says here that South African taxpayers will soon be forking out of over 700 million rands for the upkeep of the AU. Wait, panel, there's a lot of issues raised during the summit now. Protests also erupted. What's going on, do you think, here, Julie?
Okay, well, look, I'm finally glad to see that the South African media in particular is starting to take the AU summit a little bit more seriously. I think the arrival of Omar al-Bashir has had something to do with that, because throughout most of the week, a lot of the coverage of the AU summit was a little bit superficial, and the most excitable coverage tended to be around the fact that a Nigerian delegate was robbed, or the fact that Angelina Jolie was, addressing a panel before the summit. But yes, I think it's important that the media does start scrutinizing the AU and South Africa's role in it more closely. And simply because, we are paying so much of our public funds to the AU. Up until now, I think our yearly contribution has been just over 34 million US dollars. Now we're hearing that amount is going to be doubled. So that's a huge amount in public funding going into the AU. We know that the Mail and Guardian has given us coverage, in terms of the sort of financial worries that the AU is suffering from. 33% of the AU's funding is the only funding that's coming from African countries. The rest of the funding is coming from Western powers and donor funders and so on. So it basically is a situation where the AU cannot fund itself, which really cripples it as an institution. It's only getting in 54% of what it's budgeted for. So what the AU is doing now is calling for, the wealthier African countries to up their contributions. But for South Africa's contribution to double, when we are already paying so much of our public funding to the AU, and without any sort of scrutiny, any sort of public understanding of where is that money going to, and what is it being used for, those are the questions that our media needs to be asking now.
Look, Vuyo, you at the AU summit, are issues of funding really becoming an important aspect of the summit this weekend?
Well, it is certainly a big issue. If it's not the number one issue, it's probably number two, but it won't go beyond that, because the belief, and it's something that I'm told Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, the AU chair, is really determined to make it her, call it, legacy project, so to speak, where she gets the AU to a position where it is able to fund itself throughout the week. In fact, right at the beginning when the summit opened, she did say that something to the old adage that he who pays the piper calls the tune. She wants to put an end to that. But the asking, these countries that have been basically carrying the financial burden of the AU to actually contribute more is more of an interim measure, I'm told. Otherwise, she and her administration want all the countries to actually contribute, because she believes, I'm told, that the Africa of 12 years ago is different and probably richer and more able to actually pay for what it's doing than was the case, say, 12 years ago. So they are trying to actually make sure that other member countries come on board, and from what we are told, they are actually willing and able. It's just that over the past few years, no one has really bothered to actually make sure that that indeed happens. And from what we are told, Dr. Dlamini-Zuma is actually prepared to make sure that it does indeed happen. And on the, if I may, question of President al-Bashir, I've just been speaking to some of the people who are in the know, and I've been told in no uncertain terms that nothing is going to happen to President al-Bashir. He is not going to be handed over. That's, I'm told, is in line with what the AU has actually stated, that they do not believe that sitting heads of state should actually go to the IEC, and they are implementing that resolution to the full, and there is no way, I'm told, that South Africa is going to go against that.
Thanks for addressing that, Vuyo. That's exactly what I was about to ask you, the issue of President al-Bashir. Let's move on quickly and look at the City Press now. Mdluli milks the system. Now, according to City Press, suspended intelligence boss Richard Mdluli is still on the state's payroll and has been paid about 4.2 million rand while still on suspension. Now, he's alleged to also still be using the state's resources for trips and other personal matters. Akash, what do you make of this story?
Well, what do you expect? I mean, you can't. A man in South Africa is innocent until proven guilty. He's suspended on his full salary, and really what needs to happen to stop this entire thing from being prolonged any further is for the investigation to be speeded up, for criminal or other charges to be brought against the man, and if he's found guilty, to be suspended from SABC. But if he's not, well, then that's an entirely different story. So the problem here is really with the investigation and how long it's taking.
Julie?
No, I absolutely agree, and I think that, you know, it's also time for SABC to be consistent, because there are other high-ranking police officials who have also been suspended, but without pay. The City Press story reported that Ria Piega is not prepared to bring any sort of disciplinary action against Mluli, and she's waiting for him to reach the age of 60, in which case he will be automatically bumped out of the system. That's just completely unacceptable, because that only happens in 3 years from now. So he's going to earn a R1.5 million salary for the next 3 years. And so again, it's just public funding that seems to be, used wastefully.
Vuyo, what do you think about this trend? What do you make of this trend of suspended bosses going on leave, but they're still getting paid the amounts that is due to them?
Well, the Mluli issue in particular, has been dragging on, for years now without any resolution in sight. And the obvious, consequences of that is what you are seeing, where a person keeps on drawing huge salary and the perks that go with that, and all of that. Really, no one seeing anything wrong with that, and I think it's a natural consequence of justice that is not being meted out to certain people. Clearly, it depends on who you are, and I don't think that the state has carried itself particularly well on this one.
All right, let's leave it there, Vuyo, because I really want you to address this next issue as well. Sunday Independence front page here: red alert over war in Burundi. Now, apparently, former Secretary General of the Organization for African Unity, Salim Ahmed Salim, has warned that Burundi is teetering on the brink of a civil war, and said immediate measures needed to be implemented to try and de-escalate the situation. Vuyo, at the backdrop of the AU summit, but why isn't this issue being amplified even further?
Well, you'll recall that a week ago we did speak to the president of Burundi, who made it very clear, abundantly clear, and in no uncertain terms, that he is not is going to stand for election. And he has told the leaders of his region, East Africa, and the leaders of the Great Lakes just as much, that he is not going anywhere. And we spoke to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Burundi last night, and they're going ahead with the election. I've been speaking also to some of our people who are in the know, because you will recall that we were supposed to effectively fund the Burundi election and give them all sorts of logistical support. I asked one high-ranking official whether we are going to go ahead and do that, and they are facing a dilemma. They are facing a dilemma because, as you know, President Jacob Zuma is on record. Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, the chairperson of the AU, is also on record. Former President Thabo Mbeki, who we spoke to a couple of weeks ago, is also on record, having said this guy is what he's doing is not right, but he is determined to do it. The issue is going to be discussed here today by the heads of state, and hopefully there will be a resolution. But if you take into account what happened in Tanzania a couple of weeks ago, I am not very hopeful that this situation is going to be resolved differently. In other words, I don't see the leaders who are here telling President Nkurunziza not to stand. Because if you look at what happened in Tanzania, where the leaders who were there basically listened to him and went along with his decision. And it wasn't surprising, because if you look at, look at the president of Uganda, look at what President Kabila has been trying to do, although he has backtracked now. I mean, there are rumors that President Kagame wants to do the same. So the leaders of the Great Lakes region are guilty of similar to a lesser or larger extent of the same sin, and it's highly unlikely that they will have the guts or the courage to actually rap President Nkurunziza over the knuckles. So I don't know if there'll be a different resolution later today.
It's very good that we have Vuyo on the ground. You can tell us things that are happening there. But Akash, what do you make of this story?
Look, I think Burundi is an example of why a strong African Union is so important. And when we look at a headline like the fact that South Africa needs to contribute 700 million towards the upkeep of the African Union, you kind of start understanding why this African Union is so important, because a strong African Union will be able to take very strong action and make strong recommendations with regards to situations like that which is currently happening in Burundi. And make no doubt about this, if Burundi is destabilized in any way whatsoever, it's going to affect the East African economy, it's going to affect the African economy, and in turn it's going to affect South Africa's economy. So it really makes sense that the situation in Burundi is resolved to everyone's satisfaction. And again, it highlights why a strong African Union that's able to make decisions, that's able to show strong leadership is so important on our continent.
All right, so they should just bring in the money and not complain. We're going to take a quick ad break, and when we return, more stories of the week. This is Media Monitor. Do stay right there.
SABC News seeks to be the biggest, the most extensive and diverse news organization on the continent. Our mission is to provide accurate and credible news and current affairs programming throughout the day. We are committed to covering every part of the continent. We reflect the world to Africa and Africa to the world. SABC News, Africa's news leader. Now available throughout the continent.
As we continue with our discussion, if you've just joined us, our guests this morning are Dr. Julie Reid, media analyst, and Mr. Akash Bremdio, Sunday Tribune editor in our Durban studio, as well as SABC's contributing editor Vuyo Mvoko, who's in Sandton. Let's now have a look at the stories of the week. African heads of states are seeking ways of ensuring development, peace and stability on the continent in the 25th AU Summit, which is currently underway in Sandton. Also top of the summit agenda was the strengthening of its funding. Interpol has suspended a €20 million integrity in sport agreement with FIFA intended to combat match fixing and illegal gambling. Now, this comes shortly after the so-called FIFA-gate scandal that rocked the soccer fraternity and saw its chief, Sepp Blatter, resign. Panel, let's start with you, Julie. What do you make of the goings-on at FIFA? Can we expect more drama to unfold still?
I think we can expect a lot more. If things just keep getting worse and worse for FIFA, I think we can expect a lot more drama to unfold going forward, especially as various different intelligence agencies around the world proceed with their investigations into FIFA. Look, I mean, it's mind-blowing what's happened to FIFA, but it's also, I think, a case of justice, finally. I mean, this is an organization that has been incredibly powerful for many decades now, which has dominated the sport, profiteered off of the sport a great deal. And basically held countries and players and teams and markets to hostage. So it's almost a little bit of just desserts at the end of the day. Although that doesn't speak well for what's happened at FIFA. But I think the time has come.
Akash, what do you think of this story?
Look, I think we're going to see a lot more unfolding about FIFA, and at some point people are going to have to take the stand. There's going to have to be a court case. There's going to be a whole lot of drama around that. But let's also not forget that in a couple of years' time, we've got the FIFA World Cup in Russia and in Qatar. And of course, lots of people will argue that the entire focus of the FBI investigation, as well as the Swiss investigation into the goings-on at FIFA, is related to these two World Cups. And I'm really very interested in seeing whether the World Cups are going to be taken away from Russia and from Qatar. And if they are, which are some of the countries that are going to benefit? Is it going to be Britain? Is it going to be America that's launching a probe against FIFA?
Nice questions there, Akash. Thank you so much for raising those questions. We'll move on to our next story now. This year marks the 39th anniversary of the Soweto uprisings. And in honor of this, the National Youth Development Agency, the NYDA, has developed a national program under the theme Youth Action for Economic Freedom in Our Lifetime. In another Youth Day event tackling youth unemployment, the SABC, together with the Gauteng government, exposed thousands of young people to career opportunities at an education expo in Nasrec. Now, the national broadcaster also landed a helping hand by offering internships to students who have completed their tertiary studies. Vuyo, South African youth are faced with many challenges. How will this initiative help curb unemployment among our youth?
Look, I mean, every year around this time you hear of all these noble initiatives, and organizations like the NYDA, step forward to talk about the things that they're doing. But it's not something that there's a lack of consistency, because you don't see the NYDA, certainly not in the manner that I think a lot of young people would see it going about doing its work. I mean, in the presidency, you have a deputy minister responsible for youth affairs. I mean, we hardly hear of what they are doing. I think as soon as we sort of stop hearing about these things whenever June 16 comes around, but it becomes a program, a 365 days a year program, I think the better for young people. Young people in our country are agitated, and it's not without reason, and that is why you are seeing political parties actually focusing on young people. Even the ruling party, I mean, has been talking about young people precisely because they are aware that there are numerous challenges facing young people, and by and large, those challenges are actually not being attended to, certainly not in the manner that you would expect of a democracy that is where ours is or is supposed to be.
Thank you, Vuyo. Julie, what do you think?
Well, yes. I mean, as Vuyo says, at this time of the year during Youth Month, you always see, a lot of the media reporting focusing on commemorative events and things like the SABC's reporting of the National Youth Development Agency's, launch of this program that they've done. And all of that type of reporting is all very good and well, and that's the good story to tell and so on. But on the other side of the coin, there's also a bad story to tell. And that is that the challenges facing our youth are really a national crisis. Last year, during the Youth Month, we saw a lot of reporting. The media seemed to pick up on the issue of youth unemployment in our country. They haven't done that so much this year. This year, the media seems to be focusing on challenges in the infrastructure, in the education system, and so on. And the education system in South Africa is a crisis all of its own, because we know that the matric results are a sham. We know that less than half of the students that actually enter our school system reach matric. The costs of higher education are becoming prohibitive to students who actually do manage to get matric, so they can't continue with their studies. And then there's the infrastructure problem. We have children in this country dying in pit latrines. We have children in this country. Just a few days ago, the Daily Dispatch reported that children were having to write their mid-year exams outside in the dust, in freezing cold weather. In today's Sunday papers, we saw a report of children, how many children have to walk very, very long distances to school. That's 7 out of 10 primary school children.
We're going to talk about that later.
It's becoming more and more difficult.
We're going to talk about that later on. Thank you so much, Julie. Well, President Jacob Zuma will lead a South Africa celebration on the 16th at the Tshwane Event Centre in Pretoria. The president will officially launch the Mara Mentor, which is an online youth mentorship program, a partnership between the National Youth Development Agency and the Mara Foundation. Now, police stations are becoming war zones, reads a newspaper headline. Now, this follows the latest attacks on police stations countrywide. Less than a week after 4 people were killed inside Alexandra Police Station. Last week, a policeman was shot and seriously wounded in Denoto Police Station near Nigel on the East Rand. Akash, what could be the factors lying behind this latest trend?
You know, I think one of the big issues that we need to look at is the legitimacy of the South African police services in our country. And I think it's something that SABC really needs to work on, because there is the level of respect that's coming across for the police. The second issue is that there's a lot of frustrated people out there, you know, who almost have sometimes what can be described as a disregard for the law. I mean, you know, it's almost unthinkable. One would presume that someone would decide to go and attack a police station. But then again, if you balance it off with what happens in other parts of the world, I mean, this morning I was reading in one of our papers the fact that there was a guy in the States, in Dallas, if I remember correctly, or Texas, who decided to go on a shooting spree. So I think, you know, a big part of this problem has to deal with the fact that there's a disregard for the rule of law in South Africa, and it's something that SABC in particular needs to look at, because in the last couple of years their image has been greatly dented.
Julie?
Well, I think that the South African Police Service's image has been more than dented in the past. I think it's been actually obliterated in the media in the past few years, and not without legitimate reason. I mean, you know, the story that we've had in the last week is this one of the shooting at the Alex Police Station, but there are serious questions to be raised around that, because you were talking about a police officer who had his weapon confiscated from him, who had a history of domestic abuse. And there's serious questions about how he was able to access a firearm. But in the past week, Ground Up and News 24 also reported on some statistics that Ground Up was looking at when they compared the statistics of the United States Police Service and the South African one, found that South African police officers are twice as lethal as their United States counterparts. So in other words, you're twice more likely to be killed by a South African police officer in South Africa than you are in the United States. And we have seen the reports coming out of the US and how worrying that is. So I think it's a steady trend in the media over the past few years that the police's legitimacy is being eroded.
That's very worrying indeed. Now, it's our Africa update for this week. We're starting with Nigeria. Nigeria's military has indicated that plans to reopen the Maiduguri International Airport for commercial purposes are on the cards after it was shut down in 2013 following a Boko Haram raid. Now, in efforts to fight the militants, President Muhammadu Buhari held a meeting with regional counterparts to set up a combined military force to counter Boko Haram earlier this week. Burundi opposition parties reached an agreement to boycott elections, citing fear that elections will not be free and fair. A small group of people protested outside the United Nations offices in the US, seeking the international community to prevent President Pierre Nkurunziza from seeking a third term, and also calls for the United Nations to be very firm on Burundi. Ebola virus cases in Sierra Leone and Guinea are on the rise again, weeks after the World Health Organization reported a decrease. While on the deadly virus, the World Health Organization declared Liberia Ebola-free, making it the first of the most affected countries to win the fight against the virus. Has mankind ultimately won the war against the deadly Ebola virus? The media was vocal about Ebola when it broke out. Now that Liberia has been declared Ebola-free, why is the media mum? Well, it is now time for a very quick look at today's Inside newspaper headlines. Let's start with, of course, the Sunday Times. And on page 2, concern over SA tourism's future as the visa rules bite. Well, basically, this is a story on page 2, and it says the new visa regulations are ripping the heart of the SA tourism industry, according to key industry players. And below that article, there is another one that says Kenya now threatens to hit back. Let's start with you, Vuyo. What do you make of the latest developments with the visa regulations? And of course, those people, other countries in retaliation against our new visa laws?
I mean, this has been going on for a while. I mean, several countries raised issue with the new regulations as soon as they were mooted. So it is not anything new, but I guess the only time, the surprising thing is that you have our own tourism industry now up in arms. Why aren't they engaging? What did they engage previously, and what were the responses? Isn't there a way of getting that balance right? Because tourism, as stats show each year, is a big revenue earner. You cannot simply dismiss the calls that are being made by those who operate in that space. But the question is whether within government the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. It's an issue that should be easy to resolve, or at the very least, if there are genuine and very serious concerns that cannot be overlooked, I'm sure those who operate within the tourism industry space should be able to understand that. The question is whether there is that engagement, and if so, at what levels is it happening, and why isn't it happening where it matters?
Akash, what do you think the concerns should be, safety or tourism?
Look, I can completely understand why the regulations came into being. On an abridged birth certificate, you only have the name of the mum that's reflected on the child's birth certificate. So in the past, the mother could apply for a passport, take the child overseas, and the dad may never have been able to do anything about it for a period of time, unless they went to courts in the country where the mum had settled in, or vice versa. It could equally apply to mothers as well. Now there's a need for both parents to have some level of input into when a child travels overseas. But, and I think Vuyo's hit the nail on the head on this one, it's all about engagement. If you want to implement a new law that affects people, you need to talk to the role players. And we've been told by the people in the tourism sector that there has been no level of engagement. And why this is particularly worrying is because when our economy is growing at about 2%, and we know that we need it to grow at about 6%, and when tourism forms a big part of the money that we generate as a country, you don't want to do anything that's going to disrupt that. So it's very worrying that the tourism bosses are saying, we're going to see tourists not coming, we're going to see jobs being lost. It's very, very worrying, and really all that needs to happen is government should be engaging.
All right, let's leave it there and move on to another story that touched Julie's heart this morning. It's Sunday Times, also on page 8, it says, no easy walk to education for South African kids. Sunday Times does an expose with figures of the current situation when it comes to school transportation of children. Apparently, 517,000 pupils walk to school for more than an hour on a daily basis. Now, Julie, the newly proposed draft policy by government ensuring that those who need transport get it, but it says that only those close enough to the school will get the transport. Now, isn't this a bit controversial? How is this supposed to help people then?
Well, it's not only controversial, but it's also contradictory, because when government officials are asked about why is this the case, why are so many children having to walk such long distances to schools, they say because there isn't money. There isn't money to pay for the transportation to get them to the schools. And, it's not just about, there's a whole number of different problems that arise about the fact that our children are having to make these long walks to schools. First of all, they arrive at schools exhausted, and yet they still have to face the whole scholarly day when they get there. We know that children are being, victims of muggings and sexual assault on these long journeys that they have to make to schools every day. But it's not just about that. It's not just about the infrastructure or the lack of infrastructure around transport to schools. It's also about the fact that when they get to schools, there aren't proper toilets for them to use. When they get to schools, there aren't proper classrooms. Only 5% of our schools have got functioning science laboratories. Too few of our schools have got good libraries that students can have access to. A lot of our students have to share desks and textbooks, and there aren't enough chairs for them to sit on. So it's about the entire infrastructure system around our schools, which is really unacceptable, collapsing, and we can't expect our children to be academically successful in these types of environments.
Akash, what are your views?
The biggest part of our budget goes towards education, and we really need to start talking about how we're using this money that we spend on education. You know, there's been a couple of heartening attempts to try and find smart solutions to these problems. For example, in KwaZulu-Natal, and I know in other parts of the country as well, there's initiatives where children are given bikes, and instead of walking to school, you know, they ride a bike to school. Of course, it still doesn't solve the problem. But I really think that given the amount of money that we spend on education as a country, we're not getting the desired outcome. And even initiatives by government, according to the education minister, you know, to provide basic services at all different schools, we're already told that the cost factor of that is unlikely to ensure that it materializes. So I really think we need to look at how much we're spending and whether we're getting bang for buck.
All right, let's lastly look at the City Press's page 8 there. Just to go, Numbos packs for Johannesburg. Now, basically, the new General Secretary of the NUM is set to ruffle feathers in his quest to reinstate Zwelinzima Mavavi. Sipunzi's radical views include his declaration that COSATU members are not obliged to join the ANC. Voyo, Sipunzi is on a serious mission here, it seems. Is this the radical change that is needed in the trade union industry?
Well, I think he arrives, or he's getting into an environment that is very poisoned, where a lot of wrong things actually happened. And the tragedy about it all is that real worker issues had taken a backseat. And if his approach is anything to go by, it may well be a repeat of what we've seen, albeit he'll be dragging things in a different direction. COSATU is in a crisis. There's a crisis of leadership, mostly, where they are not even prepared. The current leadership of COSATU is not even prepared to concede that they are in a crisis, and that by and large, the very same people who are leading the COSATU are actually the ones who are responsible for that crisis. So as much as those, I mean, there are people who will clap hands over the fact that he, the new NUM General Secretary, and probably there will be others from the other unions who will follow suit, that they will steer things in a different direction. I think the most important thing is to go back to the basics. And I think that special Congress that COSATU is supposed to have, one hopes that everyone is going to rise above their narrow interests of like sort of little cliques and this group versus the other group, and actually go back to the basics of what are the challenges facing workers within COSATU right now, and how do we take those forward. All
right, thank you so much, Vuyo. After the break, we're going to discuss the SA AIDS conference with Ms. Zandile Myezo and Dr. Farid Abdullah. Quite a lot to learn. Please stay right there.
When bees and wasps sting a person, they inject a bitterness venom in their skins.
We have about 3 spider species in South Africa that we have to worry about. Button spiders, which include, the black widow spiders, your sac spiders, and your violent spiders.
That venom is in your system, it's in your muscle tissue. And the more your heart beats, the faster your heart beats, the faster the blood is going to circulate, and consequently it's going to get that venom into your system faster.
If you see a snake like this, the best thing to do is to just stay away from it and contact somebody that specializes in removing venomous snakes.
Join me on Health Talk every Saturday morning between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. as we unpack current health stories.
Welcome back to Media Monitor. Now, the latest report from the AIDS conference indicates that the impact of stigma on HIV people is one of the main challenges that is facing the medical fraternity in their quest to control and prevent the spread of the disease. People living with HIV experience stigma, both received and internalized, and that impacts on their ability to make use of services where these are available and make positive choices about their health. Now, the reports also show that 5% of those living with HIV avoided going to local clinics.
We must therefore end the stigma and we must end discrimination. We must take steps to build a society which we can be proud of, a society that will reduce the incidence of HIV infections, a society that will move to zero infection status as we move forward.
The HIV stigma survey was conducted by the South African National AIDS Council. Over 10,000 people living with the disease participated. The results revealed that 1 in 3 people living with HIV experiences some form of discrimination.
For me, mostly stigma happened with friends. You know, when you go out, when you have parties and you have funerals, people will make funny comments like, "Ikoloya Elia, are you still alive? Why, she's still here. Why are you living so long?"
The survey, the biggest in the world, will assist government to deal directly with HIV stigma. This will also allow people to freely test for the disease.
In order to address knowledge and attitudes of the public towards people living with HIV, SANAC will implement a multimedia campaign on radio and television starting on the 1st of July 2015 to run for a period of 3 months. The tagline on this campaign will be, "I can't change my HIV status, but you can change your attitude."
While to discuss the issues emanating from the HIV/AIDS conference, let's extend a very warm welcome to SABC News health researcher Ms. Zandile Mjeza, as well as Dr. Farid Abdullah, who is the CEO of the South African National AIDS Council panel. A very good morning to both of you. Thank you so much for being with us here.
Good morning.
Morning, Alicia.
All right, let's start with you, Zandile. Before we go and elaborate on the report on the stigma, can you briefly give us a wrap of the highlights of course, the conference in Durban?
I think before I go into the highlights, I'd really like to get into the reason why it was so important that South Africa hosts a conference of this nature. I know there's been widespread criticism before about conferences being just another talk shop. But I think on the backdrop of the fact that South Africa has the highest number of people living with HIV globally, it was quite significant that civil society, NGOs, activists, government officials, scientists, everybody in the HIV community gather to talk about what is the way forward to tackle new infections, to improve quality of life for those living with HIV. So it certainly wasn't another talk shop. Yes, certainly.
That's certainly very welcome news because, Doctor, the report on stigma took center stage at the conference. Please tell us why.
We've always known that we have a problem of stigma, but for the first time we've properly measured it. And we've also always known that people stigmatize people living with HIV. But in this study, we also measured the levels of what we call internalized stigma.
What is internalized stigma, Doctor?
So people devalue themselves and they do make certain life decisions about what they're going to do. So, for instance, about 33% of people living with HIV decided not to have children. That's a huge decision. 14 or 15% decided not to get married. 10 or 12% decided not to go to social gatherings. But quite concerning, about 11% have suicidal tendencies. So these are the sorts of things we've never really properly measured in South Africa. And it helps us now to do something about it. And the main thing when it comes to internal stigma is to provide psychosocial support, mental health services. We've learned that we can't just provide pills, that there's much more to the holistic care of somebody with HIV.
Zandile, look, the fear of being stigmatized is one of major obstacles for controlling the spread of the disease. But then how do we educate the general public about the stigma related to HIV and AIDS?
I think, Alicia, that's a very valid question. And this is where, information and the media comes in. I think it's very important and it's very key to note that stigma and discrimination on people living with HIV and those affected by HIV actually acts as a barrier to accessing health care. And these are the things that are driving the epidemic in South Africa further. These are the things that are impacting on new infections. These are the things that are impacting on psychological health that Dr. Abdullah just alluded to. So I think it's very important that information and awareness campaigns continue to be seen and heard, continue to be on the agenda, because this is exactly what will help South Africa take charge in the HIV fight in the country.
Doctor, to internalize this and really bring it home, myths associated with this illness actually continue in South Africa. Example, sleeping with a virgin is a cure, or that circumcision actually prevents the infection. What role do you think we have to play as the media and the general public in terms of forwarding the awareness to the people?
Well, clearly, if we still have 30% stigma and 40% internal stigma, we've not done enough.
Absolutely.
You know, so the National AIDS Council, under the leadership of the Deputy President, the Minister of Health, government, civil society needs to do much more. And in that light, we'll be working with the media, Alicia, I'm happy to say. From the 1st of July, we'll have a large multimedia campaign dealing with many of the issues relating to stigma.
I was about to ask that, Doctor, what is SANEC doing about education and awareness to deal with the stigma?
So an intensive 3-month project, but in addition to that, where there is extreme discrimination, somebody gets assaulted or fired or sterilized without their permission, then we have an agreement with Legal Aid South Africa to provide legal services. And we'll be advertising this service, and I can say now already this service is immediately available. A call center will take these calls on 0800 110 110. So
there's even a number.
There's even a number. So we have to do much more with stigma, but we also want to make sure that in this country we don't have any extreme form of stigma. It should never happen, you know, and we make sure. But Zandile knows, I can tell you much more about this than I do, so.
Absolutely. I mean, tell us a bit about, you know, this is very worrying when you hear that 5% of the people that are actually positive can't even go to their local clinics to access the health care that they need due to the fact that they're scared. That they were saying in a documentary that, you know, the HIV positive people's files are marked with a specific color and people in the clinic can see that, okay, this one is queuing for HIV treatment.
That's exactly what I was alluding to earlier on, that the fact that there's so much stigma and discrimination, it was a very important and refreshing element to this conference, because what is happening now, what we're going to begin to see, and this is what a lot of this advocates and activists were saying, is that the report that SANEC was leading with this week in Durban was that now there will be evidence-based research, you know, to rally and advocate for policy change and for government to actually show their commitment to fighting stigma and discrimination. Now we have a report that actually talks to us, Alicia, about the extent of which stigma and discrimination is actually hindering us from moving forward in the epidemic. And I think it's important that government is playing such an integral part of this fight, because stigma and discrimination is definitely a problem, and now we're beginning to talk about it. We're opening dialogue, and I think that's very refreshing.
Absolutely. And we also want to look at, is it stigma or ignorance, Doctor? What do you think it is in closing?
Well, ignorance is a big part, and I think we need to do so much more with public education, getting the messages out there, because even after 30 years of living with HIV as a country, you know, there's still a lot of ignorance, and we have to tackle this. But now we can do something, and we can measure it again in 3 years' time to see if we're going forwards or backwards.
All right. And the supply crisis, Zandile, is this a huge problem when it comes to healthcare and provision for the HIV/AIDS
Oh, certainly, Alicia. I mean, the country is looking at about 3 million people on ARV treatment in the country. And I think the issue of stockouts dominated talks at the conference because this somewhat poses a potential threat to the ambitious goals that government has of enrolling more people on ARVs. So it's very important that government is actually in talks with civil society groups and NGOs to tackle the issue of stockouts.
Thank you so much. Let's see what people at home are also thinking in regards to this topic. Rafio Modao says families must talk about sex and AIDS openly so that even the children get to understand the consequences of the HIV stigma. I really think it needs to begin at a child education level. And Willpower there says, sex versus virgin, AIDS cure myth, I suspect is also responsible for the high rate of rape of young children, boys and girls. Ignorance. Once again, we mentioned that. Let's have a look at more tweets. Mazwai Voklega there says, more TV plays in each and every channel and more emphasis in schools. That's another way to look at it. Thank you so much, Mazwai. Let's see if we have any more tweets there. Tabang Maketla says, awareness campaigns, I think they're effective in some way. All right, let's take one more tweet. It is from Tabo. And Tabo says the focus has to be on behavior at Anova Health SA. And how do we continue educating the public about HIV and AIDS? Well, you just go to hashtag SABC News and you'll find out all the information that Zandile and the doctor gave us today. Dr. Zandile, thank you so much for being with us here on Media Monitor. We will be back with the wrap of the show. Also get to find out some great achievements by ordinary Africans doing extraordinary things. You don't want to miss it. Stay with us. Welcome back to Media Monitor, our final segment. Do you also believe that Africans are not good with maths? If you do, you are very, very wrong. Nigerian student Forte Kong has proved people like you wrong. It only took the Japanese-based Nigerian genius to dispel the myth that Africans are not good with maths, a mathematical equation that puzzled top mathematicians for over 3 decades was solved by the Tokai University student in his first year. Throughout his university years, Kong attained 6 academic excellence awards. Isn't this just such a nice story, Julie? What do you think about this, and what do you think will be prominent in the news this coming week?
No, it is a fantastic story to bring it home. I mean, you know, it's just such a pity that this can't be all African children's stories. In South Africa, we only have 42% of children taking mathematics in matric, and only 33% of them achieve a mark of over 40%. So although it is a heartening story, we have to see it in the global bigger picture. In terms of what's going to happen in the news this coming week, it's always difficult to predict because you can never tell the future.
All right.
I'm just hoping that the President is going to release the Farlam Commission report.
All right. Voyo, very quickly, your goodbye from Santon.
Well, I mean, we are certainly keeping an eye, and we'll be bringing you special programs throughout the day and tomorrow about the outcomes. Is Burundi, is there going to be a different decision on Burundi? What's going to happen to President al-Bashir? But as I said earlier, it doesn't look like there's going to be anything different. No handing him over to the ICC. So we'll be watching that, and of course, the June 16 events over the next couple of days.
Thank you so much for your time, Vuyo. Akash, very quickly, just one word.
The Rand. The Rand. Watch the Rand.
Thank you so much to my panel. That is Mr. Akash Bremdio joining us from Durban, Vuyamvogo out in Sandton, Ms. Julie Reid here in studio with us. Thank you to all our viewers for joining us today. Please always remember that your contributions and suggestions are very highly valued. To get in touch with us, you can email us any suggestions, and our address is mediamonitor@sabc.co.za. We are also available on Facebook. Find us on www.facebook.com/mediamonitor and tick like on our page. You can very well find us on Twitter @SA Media Monitor. 2 a.m. is our repeat broadcast, but if you can't wait, www.youtube.com/SABC News is where you'll find us on YouTube. Yes, we've got you covered. For all our online updates, our website, www.sabc.co.za/news to get more info on the stories on our info boards as well. For myself, Alicia Jali, and the rest of the creative team and my panel, happy Youth Day in advance to all the young people out there. A blessed Sunday. Goodbye.
Located just outside Johannesburg, Mukondeni Fine Arts Gallery specializes